by calling this a short history of St John's, Halifax Street. Well, the original church on this site was the second Anglican church built in Adelaide, only a few years after Trinity Church in North Terrace. Now, over half the colonists were nominally members of the Church of England, so it was believed that the second church was needed in the new town of Adelaide because Trinity was full every Sunday and they thought they needed another one quickly. So Osmond Gillies, the first colonial treasurer and a very successful businessman, Mulligan made a lot out of Glen Osmond copper mines and so forth, donated half an acre of land and a nearby cottage for a clergyman to live in. It was actually a long way from where people lived in Adelaide at that time, with all the settlement was at the other end of town, on North Terrace and Hindley Street. But the cost of land was very high, gone up a lot, and so a local body called the South Australian Church Building Society, which had been formed to build churches, was delighted to take up the offer of land and from Gillies. And not where they wanted it to be, but it was better than nothing. And so the church was located here, beyond the edge of city-town settlement. Now, the colony's leaders were very keen to encourage the building of churches for public worship and moral instruction, especially for the young, because it was believed that otherwise the younger generation brought up in the colony would grow up wild and without knowledge of God's laws. So our churches were seen as an important moral instruction for the young. And unlike in South Australia until 1846, unlike other colonies, there was no state aid for the building of churches and the payment of clergy. So religion, you might say, was privatised or deregulated. Churches depended on the voluntary support of their adherents. The foundation stone of St John's was laid in 1839, but money was slow to come in, and the church was not opened until October 1841. Cost £540, which is a pretty cheap structure for the time for a church. Some of the money was raised by the Church Building Society, and some donations came in from friends in England. The new church was an empty shell, just unplastered walls, no ceilings, no pews. Very basic. The first clergyman here was James Farrell. He was Irish, with a degree from Trinity College, Dublin. Now, the Anglican Church in Ireland produced, which is then called it was the United Church of England and Ireland, produced more clergy than it could use at home, because the majority of the population were Roman Catholics. So many Irish-born Anglican clergy looked for posts beyond Ireland, went to England and the British colonies. A lot of them went to Canada, and many came to Eastern Australia. Farrell was recruited for work in South Australia by a Church of England missionary society called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which provided clergy for the British colonies. He arrived in South Australia in 1840, and he worked with the foundation Anglican clergyman, Charles Beaumont Howard, at Trinity Church, who likewise had come educated at Trinity College, Dublin. So the first two Anglican clergy here are Irish, Trinity College, Dublin. Well, Howard died rather young in 1843. So Farrell was left responsible for both churches, both St John's and Trinity. And he was then the only Anglican clergyman of the colony. So was kept very busy doing rites of passage, baptisms, marriages and funerals, really non-stop. In that period, I point out that marriages were really very basic ceremonies. You produced the papers, signed the forms, and the clergyman married you like that. There's nothing called marriage counselling or anything like that. It was a very perfunctory, brief offer. I told students it was like go to the post office to post a parcel or something. You made an appointment, he said the words, you signed the forms, and off you went. But with half the population nominally members of the Church of England, of course, there was a huge number of rites of passage. You're just going all the time. Now, James Farrell was incumbent, that was the 19th century term for Anglican clergy, incumbent of this church from 1840 until 1843. And after Howard died, he succeeded him as incumbent of Trinity Church and his official position as colonial chaplain. He also succeeded him in the affections of Howard's widow, Grace, And so they married in 1843, and he became stepfather to her young daughters. He couldn't minister effectively in two churches, and so St John's was left without a clergyman, and those services were held here for several years. Until the arrival of Bishop Short in 1847, Farrell was the senior clergyman in the Anglican Church here, a very important man in the South Australian community. He was skilled in financial matters and made a lot of money by himself by lending money on mortgage. He was a member of the Council of St Peter's College when it was founded in 1847. And on his death in 1869, he left the bulk of his estate, about £16,000, which is multi-million in today's money, to St Peter's, and that put it on a sound foundation, financial footing, and paid for new buildings. At the time, it was more important than the Da Costa estate. Everyone's heard of the Da Costa estate for St Peter's, but in fact, that did not start flowing to St Peter's until after 1912, when the last beneficiary died. So Farrell's portrait hangs in the college dining hall in an honoured place, as it should be, because he really did his legacy rescued the college. The next group of Anglican clergy arrived from Adelaide in England in 1846, recruited by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and they began to minister to members of the Church of England in villages near Adelaide and the hills, Gawler, Mount Barker, and Port Adelaide. And a man called W.J. Woodcock was appointed to St John's in 1847, so he was the second incumbent after Farrell. Now, the worship in this church and other Anglican churches was, we would say, plain. There were 2 services every Sunday. If you know the Anglican prayer book, the old Anglican Book of Common Prayer, morning service comprised morning prayer, the litany, and the first part of the communion service called ante-communion, and as well as that, a long sermon. The services were always at 11. And in the afternoon, there was evening prayer or evensong at 3. This, of course, because it was lighting. You didn't have equipment for lighting large buildings. In the summer months, services in a small, unventilated church, which lasted for 90 minutes to 2 hours, must have been an ordeal. Holy Communion was celebrated on the first Sunday of the month after morning prayer, but only very devout people stayed for that. The majority of Anglicans at this period received communion only 2 or 3 times a year, including Easter. And St John's was the first church in Adelaide to install a small pipe organ in 1848. Some of the parishioners were important people in the community. We mentioned Osmond Gillies was a churchwarden. The churchwardens were the leading lay officials responsible for the building and the finances. Among the congregation was Robert Torrens, Charles Sturt, Henry Ayres. Leaders of the community were expected to attend church to set a good example to the rest. From the 1840s to the 1880s, there was a succession of clergymen in charge of St John's, and you'll see a list of them, the incumbents, in the outer porch. Some were more notable than others. Some stayed for a few years and had nothing particularly important about them. An interesting man was Denzil Ibbotson, who was an incumbent in the 1860s. He had to retire early because of health reasons, but he had a son also named Denzil, who educated at St Peter's College and later rose to great heights in the government of British India. He was knighted and became Chief Commissioner of the Central Provinces and a member of the Council of the Governor-General of India. So the most interesting man came from this background, Sir Denzil Ibbotson. The church initially was quite isolated. Roads were little more than tracks. In the winter, worshippers had to walk through slush. But gradually, the southeast of the city was filled in with cottages and bigger houses, especially after the 1870s. But meanwhile, the church building deteriorated. By the 1880s, it was falling apart, and the City Council declared it unsafe and ordered its demolition. Now, the incumbent of the church at that time was a man called Frederick Slaney Poole, and he was a bundle of energy and was able to inspire the parishioners to think big. So they began raising money and borrowed to build the present church. They wanted a large and spacious building, seating 400 or more. I'm always a bit suspicious when they talk about seating capacities in this period. They say a church seats 600 or 800. I think they allocated 1 foot per person in the pews. And so if you jam people in here, with 12 people here, you'd get your numbers of 400. But in fact, of course, it's not like that. But it was a large building. Poole also incentivized the parishioners to raise money to build a new rectory. And that's the 2-story building next to the church over there, opened in 1884. You'll see it's a large house, 2-story, with room for servants, was seen as fitting for a city church. It shows the importance of the Anglican church, the importance of the parish, and what was fitting for a clergyman of the city church. To see another one that's still standing, the manse of Flinders Street Baptist Church. On the western side of the church was now the church offices and other things, but that was the minister's house. Again, quite a grand townhouse. The architect of St. John's was a man called Richard Garlick Holwell. He was trained as an architect in England and migrated to South Australia in 1884, initially in partnership with a man called T.H. Light, and then he was on his own. In his latter years, he was architect for the South Australian Brewing Company. He also designed a post office at Parkside, Anglican Church of St. Mark at Woodside, and also additions to St. George's Gawler around 1900. But he is best known for his design for St. John's. This, I think, was the largest Anglican church built in Adelaide up to that time. I think the only one comparable is St. Paul's Pulteney Street, which was built in 1860, which you will know, of course, had many closed some years ago and has been a nightclub and various other things since. But I think this church is probably larger in volume, larger in space. At that time, St. Peter's Cathedral was incomplete. It began first bit opened in 1869. The nave was not built until the 1890s. And I think St. Paul's Port Adelaide, another large Anglican church, built in the present one, the third church on the site, opened in 1905. So this was a big church for the time. The interior design reflected the major changes in Anglican worship and church interiors that had occurred during the first 40 years, under the influence of the Gothic revival and the Oxford movement of the 1830s and 1840s. The Oxford movement sought the Church of England to recover its pre-Reformation and Catholic past, to recover its true Catholic inheritance, which they said had been overlaid and lost and was discarded at the Reformation. So followers of the Oxford movement maintained that the Church of England was essentially Catholic, not Protestant. Of course, this ran up a deep-seated belief among most English people that it was a Protestant church, so that caused a lot of controversy. But in the long run, the Oxford movement changed the Church of England, and it influenced the Anglican Church in Adelaide, and it influenced this church too. South Australia's early colonial churches were rectangular in shape, with the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments in tablets on the east wall. So when you were bored, you looked up and you could sort of read these documents and learn them by heart. But you'll see it in some older Anglican churches. You can actually see them in Christchurch, North Adelaide, which is a rather grand church, but they're there behind the altar. But in smaller churches, they're much more visible. Most of them, of course, they've disappeared, but you can find them in some early churches. The pulpit and the minister's reading desk were dominant. The communion table was small and unobtrusive, on the same level as the pews. Not very important, because it was only used once a month. So the distinctive feature of late 19th century churches were the three-part division of the interior. You have the sanctuary, the chancel, and the nave. So in this case, you see the altar was placed in a prominent position at the east end, raised up several steps. So this reflects the teaching of the Oxford movement on the importance of the Holy Communion. The chancel the centre here, then used to have choir stalls. Chancel would have seats facing across the aisle for a robed choir, which entered and left the church in procession. So these were all new habits of Anglican worship of the later 19th century. So it said it reflected the new importance of the service of Holy Communion and the place of the altar, and a desire for more dignified worship. And sometimes, as in this church, there was a screen, a wrought iron screen between the chancel and the nave. And in this church, a screen was installed here about 1900, but removed in 1922. I presume it was, I don't know where it went, sold for scrap, I imagine. Holy Communion, which I said was originally celebrated only once a month, was by the 1880s became a weekly service, initially at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then later was on alternate Sundays at 11 o'clock, alternating with morning prayer, and then later became the principal and only Sunday morning service. So you've got a huge change in 50 or 80 years in the importance of the communion service. The nave held pews for the congregation. And you're sitting in the, I think, almost the original ones, but certainly the late 19th century. During the 19th century, in Australia as in Britain, pews were rented, either as a single seat or the whole pew. And in a city church, a pew usually cost £4 or £5 annually for the whole pew, or £1 for a single. And in this church, a single sitting was 30 shillings a year, or £1 10 shillings. Now this is a pretty hefty amount when a skilled worker in that late 19th century might receive £100 or £120 a year. But the pew rent was an upfront payment. You didn't have collections. You paid, like paying your subscription for the whole year or the whole quarter. But of course it meant that you had to have a disposable income. And that ruled out working class people who didn't have the money. 5 guineas, it's hard to work out the equivalent, but probably the equivalent for an annual sum for a pew would be equivalent to, say, $1,000. So I suppose if you put an equivalent, if you were paying $20 a week into the church and the collection, well, that's $1,000 a year. So it doesn't, but it's a lot then. Anyway, the pew rents were intended to ensure a regular income. You paid the subscription for the year, didn't matter whether you attended much or not. But of course, I said it was an option only for people who had a fairly substantial income. The rented pews were at the front, and those who could not afford to pay sat towards the rear. There was also a rule in churches that rented pews: all seats free after the second bell ceases. It meant the first bell before a service was half an hour before, the second bell was 5 minutes before. When the second bell finished, if you weren't in your rented pew, the sidesman or usher could show visitors to your pew, use it. Now, of course, you can imagine that caused unseemly quarrels sometimes when the pew renter was a bit late and found that someone sitting in their pew had to be escorted out. But this was the rule at the time. All seats were free after the second bell. Now, pew rents were not unique to Anglican churches. The city and suburban churches, the Presbyterians, the Wesleyan Methodists and the Baptists followed the same practice. And also country churches. I only found the other day in a history of a small country church on the Northern Plains that a pew would, in the 1880s, might be 5 shillings a year for one seat. So again, right around the colony, pew rents were very general. A few churches began to announce that all seats were free, hoping to encourage casual attendance. And one of the first was St. Peter's Cathedral. When the first portion had opened in 1869, it had cane chairs, not pews. So if you see churches in that period with cane chairs, of course, chairs are individual, they're not rented, and it meant no one rented them and demonstrated that it was open to all. And that was quite an important symbolic thing, really, for the cathedral. The cathedral was meant to be a church for the community and open to everyone. The abolition of pew rents was much debated. Many thought that they were indefensible. It was a social barrier in the church, discriminated against poorer people. But to abolish them was to go into the unknown. Would free will offerings in the Sunday collection be enough? Horace Finnis, who was rector here from 1918 to 1927, was keen to abolish them, but he could not get enough support at the parish's annual meeting. And finally, it was pushed through as a thank offering for the end of the First World War, when people were very keen to do something to celebrate the end of the war. They nipped it through. There's a resolution in the church annual meeting straight after the war. As a thank offering, make all seats at St. John's free and abolish pew rents. And there's a tablet, so important was it at the time, you'll see a tablet in the north porch to commemorate the step in 1922. From then on, all seats were free. It was quite a step towards democracy and equality in the church. It seems quaint now, but it was a very hot issue in the late 19th century. And the whole brass card holders, you might see them in older churches, with the end of the pew, which contained the card of the renter of the pew. These were melted down and partly was melted and used to make into candles for the altar. And the candles for the altar was itself in this church a very controversial issue, because lighted candles were certainly seen as a symbol of high churchmanship, but it was also seen as similar. It was seen as copying Roman Catholicism. Lighted candles were popish, and therefore Protestant-minded members of the Church of England were very upset when they saw them. This was Roman Catholic style, not us. But they managed to get lighted candles in also by a deft hand at the end of the First World War. It came in as a package deal using thank offering for the end of the war, came in at the same time. Getting back to the church, Bishop Kenyon, who was the Anglican bishop here in the 1880s, laid the foundation stone of the new church in May 1887, and amazingly, because we're so used to buildings taking ages to build, the new building was opened in December that year, only 7 months later. The total cost was £3,500, so there was a hefty debt of about £2,000, which was some millions of dollars, and it took about 30 years to pay off. The bricks from the old church were recycled and used to build a mission church in a poor part of the city, south of Angus Street, St Mary Magdalene's in Moore Street, which runs between Carrington and Angus Street, which you might know, just south of St Aloysius College. It's about the same shape and dimensions as the old St John's. So if you want to get an idea, of the size of the old St John's, look at St Mary Magdalene's, and it does reflect its architecture as well. St John's Church then entered a new era. It was a large church which dominated the skyline of the south eastern corner of the city. At a time when there were few tall trees and buildings were low, I'm told that the Tower of St John's was visible to people coming down to Adelaide, coming down Glen Osmond Road. It stuck up. It was one of the first things you saw as you approached Adelaide. By the 1890s, the southeastern corner of the city was filling up fast. On the terraces fronting the parklands from the 1880s, there were mansions, some of which are still there. There were villas on the main streets, and in the narrow side streets and lanes, there were cottages for working class people, many of which have now been demolished. St John's was not the only church in the southeast quarter of the city. Madge Memorial Methodist Church at the western end of Halifax Street, near Pulteney Street, was opened in 1900 and closed in 1960. A Baptist mission hall and Sunday school, which was a branch of Flinders Street Baptist Church, was located several hundred metres to the west of St John's, a few blocks from within this block, just up the street, opened in 1897. But in those pre-ecumenical days, I suspect there was no contact whatsoever. They were seen as rivals. They weren't on speaking terms. And in the Sunday schools, they were both competing for children. The congregation of St. John's was drawn mostly from the local area. About half the population regarded themselves as Church of England and had some kind of connection with the church. That is, they had their children baptised here, they married and sent their children to Sunday school. But they were not regular attenders. But in the 1900s, some people were moving out from the city to the new spacious suburbs such as Rose Park and Melbourne. And this trend continued. And by the 1920s, the drift to the suburbs was eroding the congregation. But for the first decade of the 20th century, the reach of the church, its links with the community, are demonstrated by the list of the 75 young men connected with it who enlisted in the First World War, which are commemorated in a tablet in the North Porch. And of those 75, 19 died. So you can imagine the impact of that on the congregation. It's a lot of people, and of 19 young men from the parish, linked with the parish, people who have been in the choir, Sunday school, so forth, died. The church was sometimes described as fashionable. Certainly it included some important people who lived in mansions fronting the parklands. The best known was William Bragg, the elder professor of pure and applied mathematics at the University of Adelaide. He was a lay reader, at least he was a lay person who could allowed to take some services, and also a sidesman, that is, an usher. Quite an important position in a parish at that time, person who conducted people to their visitors to their seats. And when he left Adelaide in 1908 to take a chair at the University of Leeds, there was a big parish farewell. He and his son Lawrence in his youth was also a Sunday school teacher here, were awarded a Nobel Prize in Physics for their pioneer work on X-ray crystallography. William was knighted in 1920 and Lawrence in 1941. Another significant parishioner was Charles Glover. He was a prominent businessman, civic leader, and Lord Mayor of Adelaide in 3 terms of office, over 7 years, between 1919 and 1933. And he wrote a history of St. John's, compiled a history in 1939. A congregation like this expected to have a high-quality clergy, and they did. 4 of the 3 rectors between the 1870s and the 3 of the 4 rectors between the 1870s and the 1920s were university graduates, at a time when not many clergy had degrees. And they preached intelligent sermons. Finnis, who was rector in the during the first part of the 20s, was a skilled musician. In 1927, he was appointed precentor at St. Peter's Cathedral, that is the priest in charge of the music, and in 1931 he founded the South Australian branch of the Royal School of Church Music, which was very important in lifting the standards of Anglican choirs. So St. John's built up a strong musical tradition. A new organ by the Adelaide organ builder Josiah Dodd was installed in 1902. There was a choir of men and boys who sang the morning and evening services each Sunday, and there were scholarships for choir boys at Pulteney Grammar. The post of organist and choirmaster was a prestigious one. John Dempster, who was organist here for a long time in the 1920s and beyond, was also the city organist. I think the parish reached its peak of prosperity in the 1920s. From 1919 to 1930, I'll pass around a few of these. It had its own day school taught by 2 poorly paid women. I'll pass these around just to see a list of the parish organisations from the Parish Magazine of 1927 and a period into the church as it was. Just move them around. There was a small school, primary school, taught by 2 women. There was a monthly parish magazine, which went to all known Anglicans in the area, which was probably 1,200 or so households. At Easter 1920, there were 330 communicants, and at Christmas 280. They were peaks. In 1921, it was one of the first Anglican churches in Adelaide to appoint a woman to the staff. He was then a parish worker who did home visiting, did pastoral work among women and children. A woman called Hilda Burden, who was probably the first Anglican woman in South Australia to study theology. So it was it was an interesting church, had a lot of organisations connected with it, it had many links with the wider community, had a strong musical tradition, and it was open to the appointment of a woman to the staff, which again was fairly unusual in that period. But the good times didn't last. There was the Depression, and then after the Second World War, the inner city lost most of its population, as houses were replaced by offices and warehouses. This was the policy of the city council in that period, basically to push out the residents and replace them with commerce. The population of the inner square mile fell over the next 20 years to 1/3 of its peak, and many of those who moved in were European migrants and poor people who wanted cheap housing or who lived in boarding houses. They were not church-going Anglicans. In the early 1950s, St. John's allowed the newly founded Serbian Orthodox Church to hold services here, because they were still just forming a congregation. They had no place of their own, and so they held their services in this church on Sundays, Sunday afternoon, in that period. But it was a dismal period for the congregation. The organisations dwindled, most of them died, and by the 1970s, the parish was struggling to stay afloat. It had one service on Sunday and a congregation of 30. Father Donald Wallace was rector from 1964 to 1978 and did a great deal of pastoral and humanitarian work with homeless young men in the area. He and his wife Gwyneth fostered Harold Thomas, an Aboriginal boy from Central Australia who came here from via St. Francis House at Semaphore, and sent him to Pulteney Grammar. He then went to the South Australian School of Art and later became involved in the emerging Aboriginal rights movement. In the rectory, in 1970, he designed what is now recognised as the Aboriginal flag. So that is one very important connection of St. John's to the wider Australian history. You can see the table where he did it. In the late 1970s, the church went in a new direction. It came through the Society of the Sacred Mission, often called SSM, which was an Anglican men's religious order founded in England in 1893. In 1947, SSM began a theological college in Adelaide on Mount Lofty, which some people might remember, called St. Michael's House. It was, of course, totally burnt out in the great fires of 1983. But for many years, for 20 years, it flourished, with students from all over Australia. But by the 1970s, it was running down, and the society wanted to make a new start with a college in an urban area where it could provide training for both for intending clergy and also for lay people. So in 1978, the Society of the Sacred Mission assumed responsibility for St. John's, and the rectory became a priory with a small community of priests, lay brothers, and theological students. And this arrangement with SSM lasted until 2016. Under the leadership of SSM, St. John's revived and attracted a new wave of parishioners, mostly from outside the immediate area. People who liked the ethos of the SSM with its openness to new ideas and tradition of intelligent preaching. The style, they would say, would be called liberal Catholic. They were in the High Church or Catholic tradition of the Church of England, but open-minded, open to new ideas, not conservative. To summarise the main developments since the 1980s, the big thing is what you see now is the result of the redecoration and reordering of the church interior during the 1990s. The instigator of this was Father Christopher Myers of the SSM, who was the rector here for 25 years. Which we see the removal of the choir stalls and the creation of a nave altar, the altar brought forward here, so the celebrant could face the congregation instead of being at the far end of the church. A complete renovation of the interior, guided by heritage architects and with support also from the City Council. The interior was repainted. There was wooden panelling along the side. You'll see from that photograph on the church interior, there was wooden dado panelling right around the side. That was all removed. The reredos, you see the reredos, the painting above the altar, depicting the archangels Michael and Gabriel. A hanging rood, which came in from France, monastery in France. The nave carpet from a William Morris pattern. And of course, the whole end of the church totally repainted and redecorated. It transformed the interior from a rather dull greyish, white walls to a colourful place we see now. Another development, St John's Shelter for Homeless Youth, began in the hall, but developed into St John's Youth Services, which provides support and accommodation for homeless young men and women. And the offices of that are in the upper level of the church hall. That began from this church. This community store, which plays an important role in the area and for people beyond. And also, because of its attractive interior and the excellent acoustics, this church is a very popular venue for concerts and recitals.